Hi, James. Thanks for joining us today. So, from what I know, you were very, very involved in covering the disappearance of Jay Slater.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us a bit about that?
So we broke the news that this teenager had gone missing. He'd gone on a holiday with his friends to Tenerife to go to a music festival. And his friend had basically shared an appeal on social media saying that they hadn't heard from him, that she'd had a phone call from him to say that he was on low phone battery and didn't know where he was, and he was in some kind of vast, desolate area, quite a distance from the festival and where they'd been staying. And then his phone died, and there was a location where he was sort of last believed to have been because it had pinged from a phone mast, and it was in the middle of nowhere. So friends started sharing appeals, and very, very quickly, within a couple of hours, it gained a lot of traction online, social media, thousands and thousands of shares. We were the first to break it, and it very, very quickly became this sort of huge national story about the sort of shock, sudden disappearance of this teenage lad that had actually just gone for an innocent holiday with friends.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it all started, and it just picked up so much traction and so much interest that journalists from publications all over the UK basically flew out there, and I was one of the first people that arrived. I was there, I think, about 2 days after he'd been reported as missing, so it was very, very early days.
Yeah.
Police investigation had only really just started, and there was still a lot of unanswered questions around the entirety of the case, really, and it was only then, bit by bit, that kind of new pieces of information started to come to light, and it very much unravelled as we were there. So yeah, we sort of went into it. I certainly went into it very blind, really, to begin with, and I think all of us did as journalists that had kind of gone out there to cover it, because nobody really knew what had happened other than this lad, for some reason, has been in the middle of nowhere and has just completely vanished without a trace, so to speak. So that's kind of how the whole thing started, and then it was just a case of following up new leads and, you know, new nuggets of information where we could, and kind of seeing where it led, really.
So you were one of the first people that flew out there, and you went to the place that he was found. So could you talk to us about where he was found and why did it take him so long to get found?
I think what struck me initially, and it was really interesting because everybody sort of had an opinion and a theory of what might have happened to him. You know, TikTok and Instagram and everything, it was going quite crazy, but you sort of had to be there to really recognise just how dangerous and treacherous the area was that he'd gone missing in. So it was this village called Masca, which was about 30 kilometres from the resort where Jay had been staying with his friends. It was a long, long way away, very, very difficult to reach. And there's sort of one road in and one road out, and that's the only way that you can get there. And it's this incredibly sort of winding, very narrow road with cliff edges on either side, driving through these steep ravines, mountains surrounding you. And there isn't really a lot there apart from sort of one or two cafes, a couple of cottages, holiday rentals, and a viewpoint, which it's a popular spot for tourists.
Yeah.
But aside from that kind of main route where all the shops and buildings come off, there isn't really anywhere that you can visit or venture to unless you're an experienced hiker or, you know, a bit of a daredevil. So we very quickly realised, I certainly did, having been there myself and done the drive multiple times, it was incredibly dangerous. The road was really so narrow that when other cars would come in the opposite direction or a bus would come, you had to basically be on the edge of the cliff.
Oh,
and
no.
It was really, really quite scary. And it was much the same if you were on foot. Now, we knew that Jay had left this Airbnb rental where he'd stayed the night before early in the morning and had reportedly asked for directions to catch the bus and bus times and how we'd get back.
So this is the next morning?
This is the following morning, after he'd stayed in this rental, and had essentially gone walking off into the mountains on his own, told his friend he was lost, didn't have anything to drink and was losing phone battery, and then next thing you knew, he'd vanished. And there was a lot of speculation that there'd been some sort of foul play, there'd been third-party involvement and all that sort of thing. Yeah. But actually being there makes you realise that the search teams and the mountain rescue teams and the volunteers that helped with the search as well just had a near impossible job on their hands. It would have been like finding a needle in a haystack. It was miles upon miles upon miles of just mountains, overgrowth, grass, very, very few footpaths that are signposted at all, really. So unless you were an experienced hiker or knew the kind of terrain and knew the land well, it isn't really anywhere that you would be safe just walking off without having a clear path and knowing where you were going. So I think it seemed entirely plausible, at least to me and to a number of the other reporters that were there, that actually it could have been just a tragic accident, which obviously is what it transpired. It quite possibly was. But I think people couldn't quite fathom the idea that he'd been somewhere 1 minute and then vanished the next. But when you're actually there and you can see that all it would take is one wrong step or one wrong footing and you could fall down a steep ravine 30 feet, that is entirely a possible explanation. And I think that's why, bringing it back to your question, that I think it took so long to find him was because it was just such a vast area that they needed multiple resources, helicopters, search dogs, fire crews, specialist mountain teams, along with the police as well that were conducting an investigation alongside it. And it was just an incredibly difficult task that really, I believe, resulted in a chance finding of his body. I believe that there is every possibility they could not have found it for much, much longer. I think it was very, very dependent on chance and being lucky in finding that location.
So how many days was it again?
It was 29.
29 days they found him after.
Yeah, so it was almost a month, which, then if you think of the scale of the area and also the resources that a very small island like that has, they only have limited resources, limited search teams. They had to fly search teams in from other countries. And, it's an incredibly big job. And I think that was sort of what prolonged it as long as it did.
Okay, so taking it back before the search and before he was found, he visited an Airbnb. Could you, what did that have to do with it? And could you tell us a bit about what happened at that Airbnb?
Yeah, this was actually a massive kind of question mark over the whole case, if you will, really, because I think a lot of what certainly I, as a journalist, being out there and trying to get answers as best we could, one of the main questions is why on earth is a young lad who had been partying on the other side of the island in a very popular resort with tons of nightclubs and bars and everything, why had he stayed so far away? It's easily a 40-minute drive, a very, very expensive taxi, and it's so unbelievably remote. And we'd kind of caught wind that he'd stayed with two, at the time, unidentified men, that perhaps he'd met during his time over there. He certainly hadn't gone on holiday with them. But I think that really was something that kind of confused a lot of people that were so invested in the case. And I think they wanted to know why he had stayed so remotely. And I think that even now is a question that hasn't really been fully answered. The men that he stayed with were written out of the kind of police inquiries that that was deemed to be irrelevant. There was no kind of foul play or criminal activity suspected from them or having any involvement as far as that goes. But similarly to where he was found, this Airbnb was sort of on a cliff edge, if you will. It was just off the same road that goes in and out of the Masca village. So you could easily go past it and not see it. It was this kind of really oldie worldy kind of cottage. And I think, if I remember rightly, there was it was like a family home, and there was a family that lived there, and then there was an Airbnb rental that was attached to it. Not really any public transport that serves the area at all. There's 2 or 3 cafes in the area. So Jay actually said to his friend that he was going to attempt to walk back from the Airbnb back to where he was staying, which would have taken easily 12 hours.
Yeah, because you said 40-minute drive.
Yeah, it's about a 12-hour walk, but that's not taking into account the terrain and the uphills and the downhills. So, it was an incredibly long way away. And I think it seemed like it was more just a case of a multitude of things that all kind of went wrong, and a multitude of things that were probably poor decisions. but yeah, that was very, very much the Airbnb rental and who he'd stayed with was very much a focal point of both the police investigations, but also as journalists, our inquiries as well, because we wanted to know what the sort of link was and what on earth had persuaded him to go as far as he did and stay there for the night. Because effectively, that following morning, you know, only being a young man himself, he was in an area that he was completely unfamiliar with, that had no public transport links to anywhere else really, apart from 2 or 3 buses a day, I think there were. Very, very steep roads and footpaths, and not really anywhere to go for a drink or anything at that time in the morning. So, yeah, it was sort of a very big question mark over the whole entire case, and still is today.
So from what you just said, the whole thing makes a lot of sense, to be fair. 'Cause a young lad that was in an area that was unfamiliar to him, and then having to make or find a way to make that journey back the next day, like so many things could have gone wrong. So it does make sense, but there's still so many answers and theories surrounding his death and everything that happened in that time leading to him being found.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's so many unanswered questions and so many theories still going on out there?
I think it grew arms and legs very, very quick, this. So, you know, what started out as somebody just going missing, which happens all the time. And as a newspaper, you know, we and journalists cover that a lot, you know, people going missing and stuff. I think it was the fact that there were so many things in succession that seemed to go wrong so quickly that raised a lot of questions, I think.
Yeah.
So it was kind of almost the convenience of him being in the middle of nowhere and having no phone battery and all. It was kind of textbook a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the fact that nobody had really seen him. He had asked a few people for directions the morning that he'd vanished, but after that, nobody had seen him. And I think, again, going back to people having not visited the area, people couldn't quite understand how nobody had seen him. Yeah. Again, having been there, it's a vast area. Somebody could easily not see you for hours and hours, because you can only really go along the footpaths and the main road. Apart from that, it's just desolate land. So I think that was really what started it all off. And then it was very similar to what we saw with Nicola Bulley as well.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really interesting how in both cases, the bodies were found so close to where they'd last been seen or where they'd been reported as missing. And I think it shows that all along, in this case, it was a tragic accident. But I think because people were so heavily invested in it and people had gone out to help with the search themselves as well. It wasn't just search teams that were professionals. There were people from the UK that do TikTok and stuff that had flown out to...
Oh, really?
To try and help themselves. And they were doing like mini documentaries when they were out there and all sorts of stuff. I think that really added fuel to the fire. And it was sort of like that domino effect of people somewhat egging each other on and being part of these Facebook groups and Facebook communities where it felt like a safe space to slander his family or ask questions about what might have happened or what he might have been up to, and that kind of just grew and grew and grew. And I think because as well the Spanish authorities didn't communicate very well with us, the media, to really put those messages forward and updates forward, that the kind of lack of clarity and void of answers is what people then rushed to fill. Yeah, they did it themselves. Obviously, then after his body had been found and it was the post-mortem and everything, and then recently the other day the inquest began, although it has been halted for now. But in both cases, there was evidence that very, very clearly pointed to the fact that he had had a fall from height and that he'd suffered catastrophic injuries that were consistent with a fall, and also injuries that didn't point to there being any third-party involvement or any suspicious activity that had gone on before that. So I think that, in terms of his cause of death, put a lot of it to bed, because I think a lot of people thought that he'd been, bundled into a car or taken somewhere, or I don't think they could quite think that it was probably the most obvious answer all along. I think the questions that remain now and still do, which again feed into this idea that people try and answer it themselves and spread these sort of theories online, is just the other circumstances around the case. So, who he'd stayed with in the Airbnb, where his friends are now, because there's a number of people that the coroner's court had tried to track down to give witnesses that they weren't able to. And obviously it's been widely reported as well that there was the other detail about him potentially stealing a £12,000 Rolex watch and then going on to sell it for a lot of money, and also being involved with taking various drugs. There was, drugs found in his system as well, after he'd been found. So I think a lot of that is the sort of surrounding circumstances. And I think people were just so invested that they just want the full picture. They want the full story from start to finish. Obviously, it's important to remember that to everyone else, that is what it is. But to the family at the centre of all this is their reality.
Yeah, they're dealing with it in real time.
Yeah, and they've essentially lost a young son, and I think what they want is, in a similar way, although they do have the medical cause of death and the kind of black and white reason for his death, I think they just want that bigger picture of what happened in the days leading up to and the morning of his death as well, because it's something that nobody's been able to really get a grip on yet, and that nobody really knows. So I think that's what's kind of fed into the whole, social media frenzy of it all, which was particularly chaotic when he'd first gone missing. It was just absolutely insane.
Yeah, I remember the time. Yeah.
The purpose of an inquest is to sort of for a coroner to make a conclusion.
Yeah.
And all those kind of bits of information, those witness statements, feed into that bigger picture that enables him to make said conclusion. But I think all along, it was just this case that people took on as their own and felt that they could, in some way, investigate themselves and get answers on. And I think that is just what kind of fueled it all.
Of course.